Tatiova, born in the tides of the Voda Sea, left her home in order to pursue training in the traditions of Druidism in Yavimaya. This led her to be particularly attuned to the Yavamayan coast's tides. After completing her training with the Yavamayan elves, her path would lead her back home to the Empire of Vidalia, where she would attempt to curb the more militant nature of her emperor, Mihail II. From her position near the seat of power in Vidalia, she aims to keep merfolk society peaceful, while protecting the ecosystem, as the Yavamayan elves taught her to do years ago. What's up, everybody? Today we are going to be talking more Landfall. I know you guys enjoyed the Landcat deck. This one's going to be a little more straightforward, but I hope you will enjoy it all the same. This is an island. No, I'm just kidding. This is Tatiova, Benthic Druid. This is a deck that we are going to use to generate tons and tons and tons of advantage on our enemies. And honestly, this deck is going to take a little while to get to its win, but it's going to feel like you are on a turbo train as you play it. Tatiova's effect says whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, you may gain 1 life and draw a card. So of course, we are going to be ramping like nobody's business, and our game plan is going to involve lots and lots and lots of lands. So I think it makes sense for us to start out with the land package, and as usual, we have managed to get this deck to be under $15, including the cost of the commander. Remember, the budget challenge is the commander can be $1 or under, and the 99 can be $15 or under at time of building the deck. But let's go ahead and get right into the deck list. We have a 19 card ramp package because our ramp is doing double duty as draw. First of all, we have Terramorph. Search your library for a basic land, put on the battlefield untapped, and then shuffle for 4 mana. It'll also recast when your turn comes back around. Dreamscape Artist, you can pay 3 mana and discard a card to sack any land you have, and then search your library for up to 2 basic lands and put them right on the battlefield tapped. Silkwing Scout, also remember, that's a repeatable effect. Silkwing Scout, we can pay 3 mana to get it on the board, pay a mana to sack it, search your library for a basic land, put it into play tapped, and then shuffle. Dawn Shredder Elk, same ability exactly as the last one, but it costs a little less mana. Beanstalker Giant, this card pulls double duty for us. We pay 3 mana to get a basic land out onto the battlefield untapped, but we can also cast it for its adventure side to make a big boy whose power and toughness is equal to the number of lands we control. And then we have Farhaven Elf. It ETBs to get us a basic land card. Font of Fertility sacks for a land card. Wayfarer's Bauble sacks for a land card. Frontier Guide, actually, like Dreamscape Artist, allows us to repeatedly get lands out of our deck for 4 mana and tapping. As long as we have this card on the board, we're basically paying 4 mana to get ramp and draw a card and gain a life every single turn. Kalani Heart Expedition allows us to make sure that anytime a land enters the battlefield, we get to put a counter on it. Once we hit 3 counters, we get 2 lands out, so that means drawing 2 cards. Wood Elves is the same as Farhaven Elf, except Wood Elves has the ability to grab a forest card, not just a basic land. So this can actually get our dual typed lands. Search for Tomorrow, we can play on turn 1 for its suspend cost, but otherwise it's just like Beanstalk Giant. Pay 3 mana to get a land untapped. Growth Spasm, pay 3 mana to get a land tapped, but it makes an Eldrazi spawn that can sack 4 mana as well. Remember, when you're doing your mana ramp in your decks, it's a good idea to make sure that your returns are 2 mana to get a land tapped, 3 mana to get a land untapped, and 4 mana if you are getting some major benefit like repeatability. This fits right in. 3 mana for a tapped land, but it also gives us a one-time use ramp effect on top of that. Far Wanderings, 3 mana for a basic ramp effect, but if we have 7 or more cards in our graveyard, then this will get us 3 lands instead. So 3 mana for a draw 3 is a good return. Rampant Growth, 2 mana for a land. Silverglide Pathfinder, that one. Pay 2 mana, tap it, discard a card from your hand, search your library for a basic land, put it into the battlefield tapped. It is the same return as the Dreamscape Artist, except you only get 1 instead of getting 2 for sacking a land. So you're going to draw 1 off this every turn, basically. You're going to be looting with this because you're discarding a card and then replacing it with Tatiova. And then we have Cultivate and Kadama's Reach. Search your library for 2 basic lands, put 1 on the battlefield, the other into your hand. And then Druid class. This allows us to play an additional land on each of our turns, and every time a land enters the battlefield, we get to double up on Tatiova's life gain effect. And then at level 3, we can turn one of our forests into a big chunky boy to try to win the game. We're not going to need that too terribly often, but when we do, the option is there. Now, there's a very, very small draw package in this deck. It's not a big one. We don't really need a ton of draw, as Tatyova is the deck's draw engine. But let's first go over Urban Evolution. Draw 3 cards, play an additional land. Eureka Moment, draw 2 cards, play an additional land. And Growth Spiral, draw 1 card, play an additional land. I've picked these because they either draw lots of cards or happen to be instant casts, which means we can hold up mana for counter spells. And then if we don't need them as counter spells, then we can use these cards to get extra value out of our deck. But speaking of counter spells, we also need to clear the way for how we're going to be winning the game. We also need to protect Tatyova. So let's talk about how we're going to be doing that. We have Broken Wings. We can blow up artifacts, enchantments, or creatures with flying with this for 3 mana. It's also a penny, so it fits really nice into our budget. Cancel is a basic counter spell. Normally, Cancel's not super great, but in this deck, it serves 2 purposes for us. 1, it's super cheap, keeps us under that $15 limit. And 2, we make a lot of mana. We can afford Cancel's taxes, basically. Ice Out, same thing as Cancel, but we can also sack an artifact, enchantment, or a token to make it cost less if we really need it. Negate lets us negate any type of non-creature spell. The Ertai's Scorn card costs a blue less if an opponent has cast 2 or more spells already on their turn, but otherwise it is the same return as Cancel. And then, of course, we have Meteor Golem. You know, it's a budget deck. Meteor Golem's in. We also have the mana to pay for it, so it's fine. It's fine. Trust me. Meteor Golem is fine. People who hate Meteor Golem are incorrect. But blow up any non-land permanent when it enters the battlefield. Acidic Slime, blow up any artifact, enchantment, or land. Return to nature, blow up an artifact or enchantment, or exile a card from somebody's graveyard, keeping the Reanimator players honest as per usual. Canker Bloom and Reclamation Sage and Outland Liberator are all either ETB or sacrifice themselves to blow up artifacts or enchantments. Terastodon has a huge mana cost, but it lets us blow up any 3 non-creature permanents, so any problematic things like Bolas the Citadel, Omniscience, etc. can be cleaned up with this later in the game. Woodfall Primus lets us blow up any non-creature permanent once, but it also has Persist, so if it happens to die in combat, which it will because it's a big 6/6 trampler, if it happens to die in combat, then we just get it right back to blow up another card. Speaking of cards that get right back, Spine of Ishash, when it comes into the battlefield, blow up any permanent, and if it's ever put into the graveyard from a board wipe or anything, then it goes right back to our hand, which is super helpful for our deck's strategy. If we really, really are getting cleaned out by our opponents and they happen to hit artifacts, okay, cool, we get to take out one of your problematic cards again after the board wipe. But speaking of board wipes, we need to make sure we get our cards back whenever they are taken away. So we have a pretty robust recursion package here, starting with either Helix, return a permanent from our graveyard, or return any permanent to its owner's hands, and then return a permanent from our graveyard to our hands. So we can use this to get rid of a problematic card, and then also get one of our cards back. Coital Scavenger, this is basically budget Eternal Witness. When it enters the battlefield, if there are 4 more permanents in your graveyard, return a permanent from your graveyard to your hand. Split the Spoils, exile 5 permanent cards from your graveyard, separate them into 2 piles, and basically factor fiction for your opponent. One opponent gets to pick what cards go in which pile, and then you pick a pile to put in your hand. The other goes in your graveyard. So you can get a lot of cards back with this. My suggestion sometimes might be to just get 5 lands and hand them to your opponent. Revive the Shire and Regrowth both let us get certain cards out of our graveyard for 2 mana. Mending of Dominaria lets us get a creature back from our graveyard on turn 1 and 2. And then on turn 3, all of our lands in the graveyard go back onto the battlefield automatically. And then our graveyard goes back into our library. So if we are behind and we need a lot of our resources we have spent over the game, this will reset our deck for us. Not super important, but sometimes it matters. And then we have the Perennial Behemoth. We are allowed to play lands from our graveyard, which will matter when you see what lands we are running. Now, how are we going to win the game? I've talked about getting stuff back. I've talked about making sure that we can clear our opponent's stuff up. I've talked about drawing cards, and I've talked about getting all the lands we ever could possibly want. So how are we going to win with those? Well, let's talk about our land synergy package. We have 2 of them. This is the basic lands energy package. This is our tokens and other stuff. So this is Zendikar's Royal. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under our control, make a 2/2 green elemental creature token. Rampaging Balos, make a 4/4 green beast token whenever a land enters the battlefield. And Spore Mound, make a 1/1 green Saproling token. So we can use these to swarm the board and overwhelm our opponents. We also can swarm the board using Meloku the Clouded Mirror. Pay a 1 mana, return a land we control to our owner's hand, and then make a 1/1 blue illusion creature token with flying. So with this, once we get to a certain point in the game where we've got too many lands, we're just going to yeet a bunch of lands to our hand, make a bunch of illusions, and then play those lands again so that Tatyova can keep drawing us cards. This guarantees that even if we run out of lands in our deck, which we will, we still have the ability to engage in our draw package. And then we have Gralnock the Omnivore. Whenever a permanent card is put into your graveyard from your library, you can exile it with a Croak counter. Whenever a frog you control attacks, you get to mill 3 cards, so that will give him Croak counters. You can play lands and cast spells from among any of the cards you own that are in exile with Croak counters. So whenever Gralnock swings in at somebody, we're just going to get lands that we get access to over and over and over again. So this card is going to guarantee that even if our opponents get rid of Tatyova, we still have the ability to gain lots and lots of advantage. And of course, most of the cards in our deck are either ramp cards or permanent, so Gralnock will have plenty of stuff to see. But then we get to the big mana payoffs. This is the other synergy section for our deck. Let's talk about Malimo Maro Sorcerer. He is a big, trambly, beefy boy. Power and toughness equal to the number of lands we control. This card has to be removed from our board immediately when we play it. Otherwise, we are just going to clean the game out on our opponents. Genesis Hydra, whenever you cast it, reveal the top X cards of your library. X is what you pay into it. You may put non-land permanent cards, or any non-land permanent card with mana value X or less, onto the battlefield, and then the rest are going into your library. So Genesis Hydra can get any of our big mana cards if you're spending big mana into it, and it's going to be a big creature when it comes onto the board. So even though this thing can be chump blocked, this is going to get us extra utility out of the deck really, really easily. And then we have Allosaurus Rider. You can remove 2 green cards in your hand from the game rather than pay its cost. Its power or toughness are equal to 1 plus the number of lands you control. So Allosaurus Rider is another big, beefy boy. When we swing in with our board full of tokens, and this and the Genesis Hydra and Malimo will always be clearing out at least 1 creature, even if they are being chump blocked, with Malimo being able to get its damage through. Now, what are we going to do to make sure things like Malimo just win the game? Blackblade Reforge. Equip creature gets 1/1 for every land you control, and we can equip creature for 3. So if an opponent has nothing on their board, we're just going to slap this on Tatyova and swing in for 21 commander damage. If they do have blockers, we're just going to toss this on things like Malimo to try to get that damage in that way. But let's say that our opponent is not going to die to any of our combat tricks. That's fine. Tatyova generates us life every time we play a land, so we're going to have plenty of life to just cast Hurricane. This is green fireball, in my opinion. This is one of my favorite ways to end a game in landfall. Pay X and 1, deal X damage to every creature with flying, and then each player as well. So this can stop a dragon deck in its tracks, but primarily we're going to use this to just burn everybody. So let's say we got 20 lands on the board, 21 lands, easy to get in this deck because we are an almost nothing but ramp. Play Hurricane, burn everybody for 20, and then start playing things like Revive, basically just Revive is the only one we've got that can do it offhand, because everything else in our deck gets permanent. So these are getting like Malimo back for us. But you can play things like Revive, get that back into your hand. If you want to add more generic ways to recur things like Hurricane, then you can if you so choose. But I only have the one in here because really, casting Hurricane twice should win the game. I don't see a world in which it doesn't. Not to mention all the tokens and Malimo and putting Blackblade on things. We've got plenty of ways to turn our lands into just straight damage. But let's say that we start getting overwhelmed. What do we do when our opponents start overwhelming us with stuff on their own turn? Well, this is where our board wipes come into play. We actually have access to 3 pretty decent ones. So the phasing of Zhalfir, when you play it, any non-land permanent you want phases out. It can't phase in for as long as you control phasing of Zhalfir. So we can use this to make sure that any of our cards will be protected from the board wipe at the end. Destroy all creatures. For each creature destroyed this way, make a 2/2 black Phyrexian creature token. So 9 times out of 10, we're just going to read ahead with this because we don't care about rebuilding our board if we have the ability to. And not to mention, like, if we have a board filled with the Spore Mound tokens, this is actually just making the Spore Mound tokens bigger anyway. So ideally, we should always have the biggest payoff with phasing of Zhalfir. Then we have Consuming Tide. Each player chooses a non-land permanent they control. Return all non-land permanents not chosen this way to their hand. So you get to pick one thing, and then everything else goes away. Pick your favorite thing, and then lose everything else. You then get to draw a card for each opponent who has more cards in their hands than you now. So in an ideal world, most of our cards are either already in our hand or on the battlefield as lands. So if Consuming Tide does happen to reset somebody back a lot, we might get a draw out of it. 9 times out of 10, though, we're going to have the biggest hand anyway because we are the Simic Value Engine deck. Then we have Oblivion Stone. It costs 3 mana. You can pay 4 to put a fate counter on a permanent with tapping it, and then you can pay 5 to tap it and blow up every non-land permanent that doesn't have a fate counter. 9 times out of 10, we're just going to treat this as an 8-mana board wipe. This is just, all right, everybody's gotten 2 out of hand. We're going to play Oblivion Stone and auto tap it. We've got the mana for it, and we've got the ability to rebuild our board, because who the hell cares about casting Tatyova for 13? We can cast Tatyova for 13. We are a landfall deck, after all. So this is our way of guaranteeing that we get to make sure the board is always clean. And oh, by the way, because one of our board wipes is a permanent, if you look back at our recursion section, our Revive the Shire, Split the Spoils, Codal Scavenger, and Aether Helix all specifically get permanents from our graveyard. So that will allow us to make sure that the O-Ring is always in our, or the O-Stone is always in our hand, ready to come down on the board again, forcing people to go, oh, I don't want to build a big board, but the Landfall deck doesn't care about building a big board because they're just going to reset. We get all the advantage out of this. Our opponents get nothing. And then finally, we have the mana base. Now, 28 of the 43, because we are playing a very, very heavy mana deck. 28 of our 43 lands are actually basics because we have lots of cards that get basics. So we've got 18 forests and 10 islands. And then we have 2 searchable lands, the Rimewood Falls and the Tangle Islet. They both have the forest and island on them, so things like Wood Elves can get them to your hand. Then we have Guildless Commons and Simic Growth Chamber. Now, you may not be a fan of bounce lands, but I have 2 arguments to make for you for bounce lands. Argument 1, landfall decks. Play the bounce land, bounce the bounce land back to your hand, guaranteeing that you're always generating mana with the bounce land. You're all generating draws with the bounce land. Even when your deck runs out of lands, you can still just play Simic Growth Chamber over and over again as a free draw. So that helps us out entirely. Argument 2, MDFCs. We're not running them in this deck because of the issues we are going to run into with cost, but in a deck that has MDFCs and little dual-faced cards, bounce lands get those back to your hand for reuse. It can also let you reuse things like Pachuca Bog. And then we have our fetching lands: Bant Panorama, Blighted Woodland, Shire Terrace, Evolving Wilds, Terminal Moraine, Promising Vein, Terramorphic Expanse, and Myriad Landscape. All of these get basic lands from our deck for a variety of costs so that we can trigger Tatyova over and over and over again. And then finally we have Vine Glimmer Snarl as a dual land, Temple of Mystery as a dual land, and Command Tower as an omni land. Now, normally I'm not a big fan of temples, but because we play so many lands in this deck anyway, we can afford one of them coming into play tap to give us a scry, so we go, oh, okay, I know that I need to play this scry 1. I do or do not want that card. I'm going to throw it to the bottom and get a different card, or I do like this card. I'm going to keep it in my hand because Tatyova is going to auto draw with it. Tatyova actually has pretty good synergy with temples. You can also use Malaru, this guy up here. Where are you, buddy? Where are you, buddy? Meloku, that's his name. You can also use Meloku to keep putting the temple back in your hand to keep guaranteeing that you get that scry and then draw, so that you're getting double duty on Tatyova's ability. So just honestly,
One of the few decks that I like Temple in. I'm not a big fan of tap lands. I'm not a big fan of temples. But if they are either searchable or provide some major benefit to the deck strategy, then I am okay with them in those scenarios. But that was Tatiova Benthic Druid, this lovely, lovely lady. We are going to be drawing all kinds of cards. We are going to be ramping every single turn, and we are going to be putting big, beefy boys on the battlefield that must be answered. And then we also have, you know, literally green fireball. So let me know if you enjoyed the deck tech. Honestly, I'm going to try to find a way. If AC ever gets printed at a lower price, I want to rebuild this deck with AC at the helm instead, because AC is one of my favorite commanders. Tatiova's in the 99 of my AC deck, but I figured that actually building Tatiova on her own wouldn't be that hard of an ask here. But the only thing I could say is if I could find some way to fit like Avenger of Zendikar in here so there was another guaranteed win con, I would probably do that, but the deck will generate shit tons of tokens on its own anyway. But anywho, let me know what you thought of the deck tech. If you have any decks you want me to cover in the future, please let me know in the comment section below. And as always, everybody, insert end of video tagline here. Hey, I just quickly want to give a thank you to all of my wonderful patrons who keep this show running. YouTube and Twitch are a pretty bumpy ride at the best of times, and the stability that Patreon provides me is worth more than I can say here. I'd also like to thank each and every one of my $20 and up patrons here, and they would be Red Joker, Blitzkrieg, Cameron, Dren, Jemshin, Smiling DM, Poundini, Mabbity Babbity, Naomi, Isaac, Agamotto, Jordan, Ravi, Giuni, Kiratorian, Prisma, all of you, I'm not saying that part, and Starlight. And finally, thank you to everyone else that helps keep this channel alive. While you're here, why not check out another video? And thank you for watching.